It was a few days before Christmas, 1941. I don't know exact age, but for the purposes of this video, what I'm going to say is close enough. I must have been about 4 years old in December, and I was with my mother and dad. We had gone to this department store to look for Christmas presents, and the thing that I wanted I didn't get. I wanted one of those pedal cars, and I was sitting in this little pedal car, and that brings up the subject of this video, the Second World War. My dad was talking to a couple of guys standing around, and as a 4-year-old child, I could observe that they were really concerned. And what they were talking about is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Most of the adults had, as a child you can tell when there's something dramatic going on. So anyway, that was my first memory of the Second World War. During the war, my dad went to work in Oak Ridge, and the war ended when I was about 7 or 8 years old. The community that I lived in was a brand new community that they had it was kind of a subdivision. And we were, I think, the second or third family to move into that community. And not long after that, all the houses started to fill up. And most of them, people were working at Oak Ridge. So I made a lot of new friends. When the war ended, it was like overnight, those families moved out and moved away. And I lost complete track of the friends that I had during the Second World War. I imagine that their mother or their father was working at Oak Ridge, and when the war ended, they moved on. During that time, guys who lived in the community, who were in the Army Air Force, if they were near the area in their airplane, either ferrying the airplane or out on training missions, they would buzz the community. And those guys would, what they were doing back then with those airplanes, if you did the same thing today, the FAA would probably pull your license. It was spectacular what they were doing. We lived in a valley, and sometimes those airplanes would be below some of the tree line. But as I was growing during the Second World War, it was a treat for me to see those airplanes, because each and every time that they came through, it was like a free air show. And I got to the point to where I could almost recognize the type of aircraft by the sound. And if I was in the house and I heard an airplane come over at low altitude, I couldn't wait to get outside. And usually those guys, they would buzz the community for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes and then move on their way. I was always disappointed when they moved on. But I got to the point to where I could recognize aircraft by the sound. And some of the sights that I saw, C-47s came over pulling a glider. I saw that one time. I'm sure it was a training exercise. It was being pulled by a C-47. And a C-47 has a distinct sound. Even a few years ago, some guys were using a C-47 at one of the airports to haul overload freight to different areas. And they usually came over early in the morning. And when I would hear that aircraft come over, I knew exactly what it was, because the C-47 and those radial engines, the design of the C-47, the sound of the engine would resonate off of the fuselage of that C-47, which gave it a distinct sound. Of course, my favorite airplane was the P-51. My father would listen to the update of the news. The reporter that I remember, I don't know if you can Google the guy, his name was Gabriel Heater, and he had a distinct voice, and he would always update the news from the Pacific and Europe. My brother was stationed, of course he went into the military shortly before the Second World War ended, and he was stationed in Fort Lewis, Washington. He never did go overseas, so he came back shortly after the war. My brother-in-law was stationed in New Guinea in the South Pacific, and he was over there a short while, and when he came back, that's when he got to see his first child for the first time. And I remember the day that the taxi pulled up outside in front of the house, and he got out of the vehicle and came in the house. That was a traumatic time back then, but some people say that it was a romantic time, which it was in a way, even though the world was in turmoil. Of course, the world's always been in turmoil. But the music that was popular at that time, Glenn Miller, and all the orchestras and the music, the Andrews Sisters. I was either 7 or 8 years old when the war ended, and I went to town with my mother and dad and my sister. My oldest sister and my oldest brother were not living at home. Of course, my brother was in the military. And my sister, well, let's see though, my sister was living with us at the time, but she didn't go with us. The war had ended, and we went to town, and I grew up in a small town, and back then, before the internet and all the entertainment that we have now, anytime there was an event, everybody converged on a single area. So when the war ended, everybody converged on the town, and it was packed. I've been there when they had parades, like Christmas parades and veterans parades, and they've had a crowd of people, mostly on the Christmas parades. But the crowds they have now was absolutely nothing in comparison with the crowd that was there when everybody was celebrating the end of the war. And people were beating on drums, blowing their horn on their car, and had garbage cans. They were beating on garbage cans. Anything that would make a noise, they would use to celebrate the ending of the war. So, and like I say, I was 7 or 8 years old, and my brother-in-law, he was stationed in New Guinea, and how things converge in years to come. I worked for a company that developed a gold mine in New Guinea. They had discovered a rich set of, I think there were other precious metals or ore that they had found. But the company that I worked for had a contract to go in there and excavate where the gold was at in New Guinea. And some of those people that had worked on that project came into our office, and I got to talk to them, and they talked about being in the jungle. And those people basically did not have a language. So it was really interesting to hear some of the stories of the people that had been in New Guinea, but my brother-in-law had been there during the Second World War. So anyway, that's my recollection recollection of the Second World War. And sometimes when I think back, it's like it was yesterday. It's an amazing time now when you become my age. I'm 79. I'll be 80 this summer. But I can think back on those times, and I should really write about it, but writing is so tedious. So anyway, thank you very much for listening to this rambling video. We'll see you. Have a good day, everybody. We'll see you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.